WNST Towson is the slowest sports week of the year. Don't tell Luke Jones that because, of course, something crazy will happen. We'll be sending out WNST text. Who knows? They'll deal Machado by Wednesday morning, but probably not. Luke and I are going to be in Miami the next 3 days doing all things All-Star Game. And, Luke, I don't know, man. The last 7 or 8 years, whatever it's been, it's this one counts. Now they've taken the World Series thing out of this. I don't know what it counts for other than you and me getting some sunshine and some palm trees, and you're going to be sitting in a blimp watching baseball and back the next couple of days.
Yeah, and really it's what it always should have been as far as not having home field advantage to the World Series online or on the line. I mean, it was something that was contrived. It was an overreaction to what happened in Milwaukee, which I get it. It was embarrassing to have a tie in the All-Star game.
Yeah, I was in Milwaukee that night. I bought tickets. I got ripped off.
But it was such an overreaction to something that, frankly, it hadn't happened before and probably won't happen again, or it won't happen again for a long, long time. It gets back to the All-Star Game being what it is. It's the best of all the professional sports as far as an All-Star Game. It's as close as you get to actually replicating the game. And it's a celebration of the brightest stars of the game, especially a number of young stars in the game, as we've talked about over the last few years, not just here in Baltimore with the likes of Manny Machado and Jonathan Scope, who, of course, will be in Miami. But so many of the great young players in the game, it's cool to see them all playing on the same diamond. And, I'm regardless of what the results are, I'm looking forward to seeing Aaron Judge and Giancarlo Stanton and some of the other sluggers on Monday night, and then seeing the game. I mean, I love the All-Star Game. I always loved it. I did not like the home field advantage being attached to it. It was something that, for me, it didn't ruin the game or make it better or anything like that. It was just something that just seemed so random. It had just been such a reaction. So I like that that's no longer on the line, and I don't think it's going to hurt the competitive balance of the game because, quite frankly, most of the players in that game, I think they want to win, but the number of players that are really thinking about home field advantage in the World Series, I really don't think that was on the conscious thinking of too many of the players taking part on that given night.
I think it speaks volumes to where the Orioles are, and we could discuss this briefly. We have the rest of the summer to discuss this, as well as leading up to the trading deadline. I know you've been gone a week. I did the Peter Principles last week, and you and your family doing your thing down there in Wildwood and having pizza and doing all that stuff. But, this thing's really slipping away from the Orioles, and the All-Star Game, we're back to that point where only one guy goes, right? And, I remember going up to Citi Field a couple years ago right before the Orioles started to run away, and, there were gobs. There were 5 guys there. That speaks volumes to where they've been here in the first half, and we really are getting to that point where a couple weeks ago I was probably the first guy in the local media talking about Machado being dealt. That will be a big story down in Miami, and over the next couple of weeks is where are the Orioles going to go? We've seen other teams like maybe the Kansas City Royals, maybe the Milwaukee Brewers play their way into not trading out, but the Orioles have not played their way into any sort of position or confidence level that you would say, well, I mean, why should they fold up? They're still in this thing. Dude, they're not in this thing right now.
Yeah, I mean, is there a possibility that they could win 9 out of 10 coming out of the second half? Yeah, there's a possibility for that, and you've seen some examples over the history of time. The Blue Jays a few years back, they were, I think, 7 games below 500 in June before they ultimately made the playoffs. But you've seen what everyone's been seeing really since the middle of May, and that's been really bad baseball overall. And for the most part, over the last week and a half since the last time you and I talked, not much better. They did win the final 2 of the Minnesota series to salvage a 4-game split. The bats woke up a little bit, but it's really been everything. I mean, clearly the starting pitching has been historically poor. I think everyone has seen that.
And you can't overcome that. When it's historically poor pitching, no one's ever overcome historically poor pitching, right?
Yeah, but the thing is, nothing else has really been that good either. I mean, their offense has been below average. They've kind of hovered in that 20th to 22nd in the majors in runs scored per game. I mean, that's not good enough. And really, when you think about it, it's a continuing theme going back to the second half of last year. I mean, if you go back over the last calendar year, this has been one of the lesser offenses in the American League. And as much as you can talk about home runs and all that, they just haven't produced, and they haven't produced since going back to to last July. So we're talking about the starting pitching. We've talked about the impact that's had on the bullpen. Overall, the bullpen, a lot of it's been injuries. Zach Britton missing most of the season to this point, although he's back, and we'll see how he performs here over the next few weeks and how that might factor in at the trade deadline. But O'Day hasn't been healthy. They've had to overwork Gibbons and Brock at times. So the bullpen has had the effect that the starting pitching has had on it is about what you'd expect when the starting pitching hasn't just been bad like it's been in the past, but it's been really, really bad, worse than the American League bad. It's no wonder the bullpen has, not necessarily crumbled, but had its times where they just didn't have enough quality arms out there that were fresh. So you go through that. The defense hasn't been very good. They've had their issues, obviously, with Hardy being out and trying to have someone play shortstop. We saw Jonathan Scope play shortstop in Minnesota. That's not something I would have expected to have heard at the beginning of the season. And they've had guys with defensive lapses. I know over this last road trip, Mancini and Ruben Tejada. I mean, different guys not doing what they need to do defensively. So when you're kind of talking about the problems being all over the place, headlined by the starting pitching, obviously, just doesn't give you a whole lot of optimism that run of 11 out of 12 wins or anything like that is coming. And frankly, since they started 22-10, they've been a terrible team pretty much. Let's call a spade a spade. So, can they get back to playing better baseball? Yeah, I think they can be better, and I think you'll see Kevin Gausman be better in the second half than he was in the first half overall, and I think you could see some other guys pitch a little bit better, but better, that's not good enough. It needs to be much, much better, and I just don't think there's enough evidence there to really think that's going to happen. I mean, as much as you can look at some of these peripheral stats, and I know so many people have poo-pooed run differential, going back to 2012 when the Orioles won 93 games and didn't have an overly impressive run differential, but that number is typically a good indicator of future performance, and if that's the case, the Orioles at minus 78, second worst run differential in the American League, there's just not a whole lot there to really support that they're going to go on a run. So then you get into the question, okay, are you going to be buyer or seller? That's well and good, and obviously that's the big factor here, and we've talked about this. We'll continue to talk about it with ownership and the future of Dan Duquette, the future of Buck Showalter. But even if you come to some kind of understanding there, here's where I've kind of talked about this privately with friends of mine or other media folks. You look at the Orioles, their best trade pieces right now are Manny Machado, who had a nice series in Minnesota but is hitting .230, Zach Britton, who is coming off of a 2-month-long forearm injury and has to show that he's healthy and the same guy. And, beyond that, you're talking, okay, Brad Brock, yeah, that would be a good piece, sure. I'll buy that, but the pieces that are kind of no-brainers, guys like Seth Smith or Hyun-Soo Kim or guys like that, they're not going to fetch you much. So it really comes down to, it's one thing to say if you're going to be a buyer or seller and determine, okay, it's not in the cards for this year, then you have to really determine, are you going to pull the trigger on Machado and Britton? And the problem with both of those guys, right now, the value isn't at optimal value. So,
yeah, we were hoping Machado was having a Trey Mancini kind of year, and if he were, maybe they wouldn't be 4 games under 500 at the break, right?
Right. And that's kind of where you get into this catch-22, because for the many fans and media that are talking about selling, and look, I don't think anyone's being completely naive to that point anymore, at least where they stand right now at the All-Star break being 4 games under 500, and we're just 6 games below 500 a couple of days ago. But the problem is, you do look at the wild card, and you see that, even the top wild card, which is the Yankees now, I mean, they've been miserable for a few weeks now. So you have no one really separating themselves in this wild card race. And that's not to say that I think the Orioles are a contender, but if you have Machado go on a tear and Zach Britton starts pitching better and some other, or pitches well, pitches like himself, shows he's healthy, I should say, and you have some other guys pitch better, they could go on a decent enough stretch that might fool you might fool themselves into thinking that they can actually make a run at it. So it's almost as though if you're a fan wanting to see them sell, you almost have to root for them to continue losing. But how does that look? That's not to say Manny Machado doesn't have great trade value right now. I think you can get, if Manny Machado were hitting 290 right now as opposed to 230, I'm not sure how much dramatically better the haul would be potentially, but you'd sure like to see him hitting and performing at a much higher level than he has. But Britton, to me, that's a really intriguing one because if he could show over the next 2 weeks, however much time's left until the trade deadline, once they resume action on Friday, if he can show over a 10 to 13-day period where he can rack up 6 or 7 saves, look dominant, and show that he's fine, then, okay, that's a heck of a piece you have there, especially when you look at what the Yankees got for Aroldis Chapman last year, what they got for Andrew Miller. I mean, that's a really intriguing possibility there, but I'm not sure any team's going to go and give up 4 prospects for Zach Britton without seeing him be the Zach Britton that he's been the last couple years. So that's when you peel back the layers of just saying buyer or seller, I think you do look at some of these potential pieces that they could sell, and they're either not attractive, like that second tier of guys that I talked about, guys that have expiring deals and either aren't performing at a high level or flawed players. Seth Smith can't hit left-handed pitching. Hyun-Soo Kim's not a defensive player whatsoever. Ideally would be a DH for a team looking for someone of that, a hitter of that ilk. But these guys they're not going to fetch much. And that's not to say you shouldn't trade them. That's not to say that you couldn't potentially get a complimentary piece. But the real bacon here, the real sexy discussion here is Machado and Britton. And I think you could throw Brad Brock into that equation as well. But are the Orioles going to go to that length of selling, or is it going to be kind of halfway? Or are they going to sell it all? 2015, I can remember you and I talking about this, and they weren't in much better position than they are in now, and they ended up, they added Gerardo Parra and tried to go about it that way. So I certainly hope they don't do something like that, where they're giving up pieces for something that's not going to move the meter. But the real question is, if they do sell, are they going to dive in head first and do it, or is it going to be selling off the Seth Smiths, the Hyun-Soo Kims, seeing if someone would take a flyer on Wade Miley like the Orioles did a year ago, moves like that, which, frankly, you don't have much faith that you're going to get anything in return that's really going to help you meaningfully down the road.
Well, we know they're not going to be buyers at this point, right? Right?
You wouldn't think so.
No, they don't have much to buy with, right?
Well, and there's that, too. You're absolutely right. I mean, they could rack off, hypothetically, could they win 10 of their next 12 and suddenly they're on the cusp of being the second wild card? Yeah, that's possible. I wouldn't bet on it, but that's possible. But then it runs into the problem that you just suggested. Even if you're going to be a buyer, what exactly are you going to give up? And again, what are you going to give up that's going to dramatically improve your ball club in return? I mean, it's not as though Zach Davies was going to be a top of the rotation starter for the Orioles, but certainly could have helped them over the last year and a half.
Well, you're always competing at the deadline against everyone. I mean, if they're dangling, if they're looking to get a pitcher, so are the Yankees. If they're looking to get an outfielder, so is everybody. I mean, that's just kind of. And they've never had the most bullets in the gun, even to pull off the trades they've pulled off in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, even 2014 when they traded Eduardo Rodriguez to get Andrew Miller. I mean, remember there had been some talk that they were interested in John Lester, but they were going to have to give up Dylan Bundy and Hunter Harvey or one of those guys and Eduardo Rodriguez. I mean, that right now they have a couple pieces here and there, but I think you have to look at this and say, things are bad. You think things are bad right now? I mean, this team is, if they stand pat, let's just say, they're falling off a cliff at the end of next year. I mean, when you're talking about Machado and Britton and Jones, and just go down the list. I mean,
Brock.
Right. So it just comes down to it. You got to be pragmatic at some point, and I think there's still a middle road here. And I'm not saying this is how I would go about it, but I could see them hypothetically behind closed doors say, okay, it's clear it's not going to happen this year, but and you know very well that this would be coming from ownership, but there could be a thought that they could make one more run next year and not trade Manny Machado and not trade Zach Britton and not trade Brad Brock and just kind of clear off the the extra pieces that they have right now and expiring deals that they have right now. Like I said, I don't think that's going to dramatically improve their ball club moving forward. But I think if I had to bet right now, if you were going to ask me, as we're talking now, getting into the second week of July, what I think is going to happen, that's the scenario that I see happening. I don't anticipate them trading Manny Machado. That's not anything I've heard, but it's just how I think they're going to operate.
I'll be blown away if 3 weeks from now you're sending out a text that they dealt Machado.
Yeah.
I don't think they have the balls to do it, to be honest. I don't think they have the comments. I don't think that the owner has that in him. I just wrote a book about it, and we've witnessed this for a quarter of a century. They've never dealt Manny Machado. Why would they begin to do that now?
Yeah, I guess the closest they've gotten, and not that he was Manny Machado, but Eric Bedard was a pretty attractive piece at that point in time. They did trade him. As far as any kind of recent history, that's about as close as you get, I suppose. I mean, unless we're going to talk about deals that were vetoed in 1996. But if Machado's going to be dealt, I'm guessing it's going to be in the offseason, if it's going to happen. And that's not to say that I think it's definitely going to happen, because I'm not sure that this organization is going to throw in the towel, so to speak, and start looking at the future. And that's why I've said that so much of this discussion, to me, feels like a moot point until there's some semblance of clarity on what's happening with Dan Duquette after next year, what's happening with Buck Showalter after next year. You either determine that you're going to go in a different direction, and Duquette says, I don't want to come back, and then you look to the future, and to me, then you should part ways with him at the end of this year, or you kind of have lame duck status, and then, well, is Dan Duquette, Dan Duquette's not going to try to rebuild and make him look bad in his final year in Baltimore by having a really crummy team, even if that means they fall off a cliff next year. So it's really tough to gauge it, and I don't need to tell you this. You know it. You've talked about it for a long, long time. But until there's some level of clarity as far as what the future is going to be in the front office and in the dugout, it's just so difficult to talk about this. And in the meantime, you have a team that's 4 games below 500, and
needs some real grown-up decisions here over the next 3 weeks.
Sure,
Tough decisions here.
This is critical. This is I think it would be naive to think that they're going to be able to, even if you could trade Machado and trade Britton and trade Brock and get great hauls, there's going to be at least a couple lean years. I think that's obvious at this point. But can you do it where maybe by 2020, 2021, you're suddenly much younger and you're in pretty good position again? Or is it going to be a case where you just let these guys leave and you're going to be god-awful for 5-6 years? So, it's critical. And I'm not saying there's one perfect way to go about it, but I think and I said this to you back in the offseason even, talking about Zach Britton specifically, but to me it should hold true with anyone they have at this point. And to me, it's organizational negligence to not at least explore it, not at least see what you could get. It doesn't, just because you say, okay, we're going to explore the possibility of trading Manny Machado, it doesn't mean you have to do it. If you don't get a deal that you're happy with, don't trade them. Don't trade them for spare parts or some guys that might be AAA prospects but have very limited ceilings. You can be selective when you still have him under control for the next year and a half. Now, you come to next year's trade deadline, if you're at a position where you're out of it and looking to sell, then he doesn't have as much value because you're only talking about a team getting him for 2 or 3 months. So, it's really a critical time. And to me, I'll say this much: regardless of what they ultimately decide to do, all options should be on the table at this point. And if they're not, then shame on them, because you're really putting yourself in a position where you're giving yourself a really tiny margin for error, whether you're talking about whatever slim hope is there for them to make the playoffs this year, whatever hope, which, okay, could they have some chance to do what they did last year in 2018 if you decide to keep the band together? It's possible, especially if you would go out there and get another piece or two somewhere, and some young guys develop in the meantime. But again, I'm not necessarily talking about a team that would be a favorite for the playoffs by any means. So if that's what you're talking about, if you're talking about fairly slim odds or very slim odds this year and not great odds next year, you have to consider this stuff. I mean, you have to at least be open to the idea, and then if a team blows you away, then pull the trigger. Don't be afraid to be bold. If a team doesn't blow you away with an offer for Manny Machado, then hold on to him, and then you can revisit it in the off season. So it's not as though they have to trade all their players in the next 3 weeks, but it's certainly something that you have to at least be looking at all of your options.
I don't think anybody in the fan base would freak out if they dealt Machado at this point. The freak out would be on Angelos himself. I mean, dude, they can't run a rundown properly right now. Literally. You know what I mean? That's where they are. I mean, they won a couple ball games over the weekend. Good for them. But just in general, this has been a disturbing year, and some asses should be kicked, quite frankly. Some pieces should be moved around. They're not winning with what they have. What they've put together isn't good enough, quite frankly.
Yeah, and what you've really seen is, it's not as though they had terrific depth all the time over the last 4 or 5 years when they've been at their most competitive. But they've had some guys, whether it's someone at AAA or someone they acquired or someone that was in long relief like a Vance Worley who could come in and give them some quality, a quality start here or there, and they had some guys like that, and they went about it trying to do the same thing this off season. And it's very clear, other than Richard Blyer, it hasn't worked. And it's not as though Richard Blyer's been a starter for him. He's been a left-handed reliever out of the pen, and that's been great. He's been able to help them. But of all those names that we talked about, all those different players they acquired for cash considerations or a player to be named later, you kind of get what you pay for. And you're hoping at least a couple of those guys can pop. And they've had one. And I hate to even say pop because it's not as though Blyer's had a major impact. They haven't been able to find that Miguel Gonzalez to help them this year. And goodness, they certainly need it given the state of their rotation. So it's not as though they did things dramatically differently this past offseason than how they did over the last 3 or 4 years. But they didn't get as lucky with finding another diamond or two in the rough. And they've had a bunch of known commodities underperform. We've talked about Machado. We've talked about Chris Davis before he got hurt. We've talked about Trumbo not being the guy he was last year, but Tip being the guy that he was for most of his career prior to that. We've talked about the fact that other than Jonathan Scope and Trey Mancini, it's tough to really look at the position players on this roster and identify guys that you'd say, man, he's really having a good year. I mean, it's been Scope and Mancini, and I'll give Caleb Joseph a nod just because of what happened last year being such a disaster. But when you're talking about your backup catcher being one of the few guys that you'd say has maybe overperformed compared to what you expected, that's a problem. And that's another reason why the Orioles find themselves where they are beyond just the fact that the starting pitching has been so awful.
All right, we're off to Miami. Luke, I rated it 30th of the 30 Major League Baseball stadiums, and only because there weren't 31. Now that Atlanta's back online with a second stadium, I would drop it to 31 because I enjoy Turner Field more than this dump. But I know, the big story down there is going to be home runs in the game, right? And of course, the big story is going to be the sale of the ball club itself.
Yeah. I mean, that's going to be a big story there locally. But I mean, like I said, the home run derby, when you have Aaron Judge and Giancarlo Stanton, I mean, everyone's looking forward to that, regardless of whether they end up being the ones standing at the end. And, I mean, it's the All-Star game. I mean, I'm excited personally for my first All-Star game in person because, as I said, it's the best game that you're going to find. I would expect there's going to be a lot of talk about pace of play and length of games and what's going to happen there. Changes are coming. I can tell you that. I mean, I know Buck Showalter's talked about it. The idea of a pitch clock and different things of that nature. I would expect there's going to be some dialogue there. And as you mentioned, the future of the Marlins themselves as far as ownership there. It's going to be an interesting story. But, disappointment of the Orioles only having one representative aside, and tip of the cap to Jonathan Scope. As much as this has been a disappointing club, a very disappointing club to this point, over the last 2 months specifically, he's had a terrific year. I'm excited to see him get some spotlight. I mean, he's he's seen a lot of his teammates go to All-Star games over the last 3 or 4 years. Good to see him get some recognition, but beyond that, the All-Star game is one of those few things that I get romantic about when it comes to baseball. Forget about the home field advantage.
And this is your first All-Star game. So this is a big deal, right?
And the idea of, as much as we've talked about some of the issues that baseball has, and pace of play and length of games, and trying to get a younger audience, when you look around and see the amount of young talent in this game right now, it's exciting, and that's something that baseball needs to market correctly. They need to take the necessary steps to maximize that. But as much as there are things that need to be improved, this game is also the talent, the ability that we're seeing. From a home run standpoint, from a velocity standpoint. I mean, we talk about strikeouts being what they are, and look, some of that's counterproductive. As great as some of these pitchers are to watch, you can certainly argue that the swings and misses and the strikeouts that we're seeing now, because of so much velocity, hurt the game. But those issues aside, and those issues aren't going to go away over the next few days, I'm looking forward to celebrating the national pastime a little bit and just seeing some of the young players around baseball. And even though it hasn't worked for the Orioles collectively, Jonathan Scope at 25 years old, pretty cool to see him getting a chance to be in an All-Star game. And the way he's performed, you hope he gets a chance to do something meaningful.
All right, we'll see to it that you get a souvenir pen or a notebook or a cap or something like that. But you've been to enough Super Bowls. I know how you handle yourself at these big events. So I will gladly play the role of chauffeur and Cuban food eater. And I might even get a grouper sandwich before it's all over. Stone crabs are out of season. I'm pissed about that. If I'd have known that, I wouldn't have gone to Miami in July. But I got to Google that. It's for next time. But, hey, we will be spending a little time together next couple days. Luke Jones joining us here. Of course, he is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter attending his first All-Star game. We're going to be in Miami all week long. You can find our work in the Bayou Toyota Audio Vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. You can also get our morning newspaper shipped to your email inbox free of charge each and every morning at 7 a.m. That's all brought to you by Planet Fitness. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. From Miami, we are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.